Ready? We're making it to the halfway point today. Number 50. It's been a great list so far. Again, don't get too hung up on the rankings of these lower guys. It's interchangeable. I wouldn't be offended if you wanted to change the last 40, 50, 60 guys around completely. It's fine. You know, it's hard to rank 100 things. And I've learned so much making this that I'd personally change some of these rankings already. So keep that in mind. And so don't get too upset when someone you love is low. It doesn't mean a lot, you know. The point was to cover the body of work of these players and to see who was on the scene making records during this time as leaders. And then to kind of discuss as we go the different streams and threads and who's in the Hawkins, Webster, Dexter Gordon school, you know, who's more of the modernist, who's straight in the swing school. There's lots of different things that we're touching on besides just the ranking. The rankings, like I said, it's a pretty arbitrary thing. And after number 40, I kind of just split stuff up so that it wasn't all one era here, one era there. You know, I wanted to kind of have different guys from different time frames throughout that last 60. I can't tell you how much I've learned doing this. It's pretty crazy. But you're always learning in jazz. It's a pretty infinite well that we dig into every day. Where's this guy going to end up? It's one of my favorites, I know that. And sometimes I give a guy a ranking just because I really like his stuff. There's a couple guys on this next 10 here that are probably higher than they should be, but I like them a lot. So you get that spot because I listen to you on a regular basis. And ultimately that's one of the great measuring sticks of how much you like an artist, and even on some level how great are they, is how listenable is it? How much do you want to come back to it? And that's going to change for everybody, but I think people as they age do follow similar trajectories for the most part. So number 50, Billy Mitchell. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I don't have either of his albums as a leader on Smash. I got one of them in the mail. I was hoping it'd be here, but it didn't make it on time. It'll probably be here Monday or Tuesday. It's a great cover, him smoking black cover on Smash. I had a bid on a Juicy, that's the other one, and for some reason that auction just ended and the record disappeared. Don't know what happened there. But he's co-leader with a lot of records with the great Al Gray. And if you remember my trombone series, and if you remember me talking about throat grabbers, Al Gray, he's this incredible trombone player who plays with Basie, who just owns and dominates the plunger, the mute, and effects. He warbles, he speaks, he grunts. There's all these sounds he makes that I've been numerous times like, that was a trombone that just did that? How the fuck did that happen? They're both Basie alumni. So Billy Mitchell and Al Gray do a number of records together on Argo, and this one specifically on Specialty, which we're listening to right now, is a really tough find. It's called Dizzy's Atmosphere, and it's because these guys all played in Dizzy's big band for a while. Charlie Persip on the drums, Lee Morgan, Paul West, Billy Root, who's a guy I forgot in my white saxophone players, Billy Root, but he doesn't have a lot of records as a leader, if any, that I know of. And Wynton Kelly's on the piano. Really great band. Billy Mitchell, born November 3, 1926, Kansas City. That's the name that hasn't popped up a ton in this list. He moved to Detroit, moved around a little bit after that even. He was close with Thad Jones growing up, part of that whole Detroit scene. He played with Woody Herman briefly in the early 50s. He replaced Gene Ammons actually in Woody Herman's group. Some great horn players came through Woody Herman's ranks. He's also playing in 1949 with Milt Buckner, the organ player, who also plays vibes, I've found out. 51 through 54, he's one of the house band members at the Bluebird in Detroit, Michigan. There's a lot of great musicians coming through there, and he's going to be one of the house players that's just kind of there backing whoever comes to town. He played with a guy by the name of Ollie Jackson and Oliver Jackson. They were kind of his bandmates on stage. Terry Pollard, the great pianist and vibe player. She's a gal. She's fantastic. Her 10-inch on Bethlehem is a tough thing to find. Elvin Jones was a part of that group as well at the Bluebird. And like I said, a lot of great people came through Detroit. You had a really black population and a lot of money. Even for the black community, there was some prosperity there. I briefly, in '53, played with Miles, which I don't recall where or when, but he does play with Miles in '53, so probably didn't record, they probably just played together. '56, '57, he's playing with Dizzy, as most guys were. In '66, '67, and '57 to '61, he's playing with Basie. So Basie 57 to 61, and then he comes back in the late 60s, he comes back to Basie. And Basie's guys do that. They come and they go. It's just probably a fun place to end up for a while, move on, then come back. It's a nice home to come back to. It's kind of Basie band. In the 60s, he's working with Al Gray, also from Basie's band. And then he works with the Kenny Clark, Frosty Bull on big band in Europe for a while in the late 60s and early 70s on a lot of their recordings. He makes those 2 LPs on Ed Smash, as I referenced. He makes a couple of records with Al Cohn, where they're kind of co-leaders as well. And then if you look at Basie's Roulette years, he's all over that stuff. You know, Billy Mitchell's throughout that stuff. So this specialty record, it's been reissued a few times, but this is a hard to find record on the specialty label. I think it's the only thing I have on that label, if I recall. I can't even off the top of my head think of something else that's on there, although I know there is other stuff. Great record. Swings hard. The Al Gray stuff is really outstanding. Al Gray, Billy Mitchell, Argo 689, Al Gray, Night Song with Billy Mitchell, 7-11, Al Gray, Billy Mitchell, Snap Your Fingers. I think he shows up on a couple of other Al Gray's records on Argo as well. Billy Mitchell's a guy to keep your eye out for. Like I said, there's not a ton of work by him as a leader. You're going to find him more as a sideman. But he's a prolific, hard-swinging, hard-driving sideman that really makes him a jazz royalty. You know, he plays blues. He's got that Detroit guts to him. And that's ultimately the ultimate measuring stick. That's one of the things I do want to drive home again, is that for the best I can see, musicians have 4 things that can propel them. And all have at least one. Some are motivated by 2 of these things, and even some could go after 3 of these things. You can be motivated by sexuality. We can be motivated by ego. We can be motivated by money. And we can be motivated by... Sorry, I had to sneeze. We can be motivated by our soul. So it's... Soul can motivate a player, a musician, an artist. Ego can motivate an artist. Money. And sexuality. Those are the 4 things that drive art as motivating factors. Are there other things? Possibly, but they're probably all going to fall back under one of those 4 categories. Fame comes down to money and ego. You know what I mean? Intellectualism, virtuosity. Those things are a byproduct of ego, or they can be a byproduct of my soul. The repeated expressing of my condition has made me a virtuosity as a byproduct. You know, and a lot of these cats are driven by sexuality and soul, and some music's driven much more by ego and intellectualism. And look how smart I am. I can dissect this music. And I think for me, as I've gotten to be a more mature listener, a player's motivation reveals itself fairly quickly. You don't have to spend too much time listening to a guy to kind of hear where they're coming from. And some of the guys who are just great players, that's not enough. I'd rather listen to a lesser player who's coming from his soul Take a Lightning Hopkins who does the same song 100 times, barely any different. But he's got such guts to him that I can always get with it. See what I'm saying? So what's a player's motivation? And I think that's a problem with some 70s and 80s jazz for me. Because a lot of that seems to be driven by ego, intellectualism. Look at my ability, look at my talent, notice me. And it doesn't seem to be driven by a necessity as much as it is, put the spotlight on me again, please. You know? And it's a very different engine. And it makes people play from a different place. And I think it takes a little bit of maturity to kind of perceive this stuff. You know, when I was first listening to jazz, it was all just great improvisation, great virtuosity, great playing, and you don't really hear the different things that drive different players. But once you start digging deeper into those motivations, it kind of helps you select what styles am I really into. And if I just want to hear a guy play because his ego is telling me how great he is, I can put Joe Satriani or Steve Vai on. But, ew, Angry Malmsteen, I'm not into that. I don't want to hear a guy boasting of himself. Why boast of thyself, O evil man? Bob Marley once said. And this can be arbitrary, you know. And I'm sure a lot of players have an arc in their career where it comes very much from a place of hunger and drive and soul, a sexuality early on, and then ego, intellectualism, money can start taking over control of the ship eventually. Number 49, a guy who I love dearly, Selden Powell. Selden Powell makes two great records on the Roos label in the mid-50s, 2205, probably 55, and 2220, probably 56. They're both pretty tough to come by, both becoming rather expensive as well. Selden Powell was born 15 November 1928 in Lawrenceville, Virginia. He plays with Tab Smith in 49 on the United Records, kind of a smaller label. 49 to 51, he's playing with Neil Hefti, one of the great orchestras in LA that's doing a lot of different show tunes and music for films. Hefti has some great arrangements, including Batman, stuff like that. He plays with Louis Bellson for a while on the West Coast as well. In the 60s, he starts diving more into soul jazz, playing with guys like Clark Terry, Lou Donaldson, Buddy Rich, Sonny Stitt, Johnny Hammond Smith, Billy Taylor, Art Farmer. So he's playing a lot of great talent. He doesn't have a ton of stuff as a leader. These are the only two that I have or even know about. I did look up his discography. I think there's a few other things that come out a little bit later, but these two records are both really sought after, and if you have a chance to grab them, you should. They're outstanding. He's got some of that Dexter Gordon feel, a little bit of Ben Webster feel, just a great emoting center. He's also capable of doing a nice hard driving swing, and for me that's my wheelhouse. You know, that's where I thrive and function the best. Number 48, John Jenkins. Great little alto player. John Jenkins was born January 3, 1931. Chicago area guy. He starts off in the alto and the clarinet, moves on to the saxophone. 49-56, he's at Roosevelt College in Chicago area. He's playing with guys like Art Farmer around the area at that time. He, in 57, ends up joining Mingus. He records a few LPs with him. He makes a couple records at Prestige in 57. Alto Madness with Jackie McLean, which is in my Jackie McLean section. And then a record with John Jenkins, Clifford Jordan, and Bobby Timmons. I think that's in my Clifford Jordan section. So he kind of shares leadership on those titles. This one's also shared leadership here on the Regent label, shared with Donald Byrd but Jenkins kind of gets first listing here, so I give him Jenkins. And even this one, he kind of co-shares with Kenny Burrell, although he does get the header there. Jenkins is a great little player, really lively, some Parker in him, nice sprightly tone, full of life and brightness. He plays with Teddy Charles, Sahib Shihab, sorry, Wilbur Ware. He ends up dropping out of music in 1962 completely, and ends up being in New York, being a street merchant and a messenger. He's selling trinkets on the streets and doing messenger work, and that's not the happiest of endings, I guess, but maybe he was happy doing that. I don't know. I guess he does end up picking up his saxophone somewhat later in life and starts playing it on the street, and people seem to really enjoy that. So he had a bit of I won't say a resurgence, but he did come back to music, which most musicians do eventually. This Blue Note's number 1573. This is a classic records reissue I bought probably 20 years ago. Tough record to come by, and anytime you have Kenny Burrell on a record, I'm gonna buy it. That's a great rule of thumb that everybody should live by. Number 47. This is going to be a tie, and I wasn't going to do any ties, but as I was going through my sessions up into the I was like in the mid-70s, and I was pulling something from my Jazz Journal episode, and I saw that I didn't pull Walter Benton. And I really like Walter Benton, and he deserves to be on this list. And so what I'm doing is I'm sharing number 47 between Walter Benton and Fred Jackson. And they're both got limited discographies, which is why I put them together. They both make one record as a leader. Fred Jackson was born in Atlanta in 1929. He played with Little Richard from 51 to 53. He does some work at Savoy with the singer Billy Wright. Does some work with the singer Lloyd Price. In 61, he plays with B.B. King. In 62, Blue Note hires him. And he does some work with Big John Patton, Babyface Willette. He makes this one record as a leader, which is a really outstanding record. Earl Van Dyke is on this record on the organ, who ends up joining the Motown Funk Brother Band, which is one of the great bands of all time. He's firmly in the soul jazz, lending itself to R&B sound. Hootin' Tootin's a great record. It's something you should pick up if you have a chance to grab it. And it's really a part of the Blue Note sound. That R&B groove, soul jazz, Blue Note and Prestige are the real progenitors of that. You know, they really are putting that out for the black audience that jazz has left. And it doesn't have a lot of black audience left by this time. You know, R&B, Ray Charles, Aretha, the landscape's changing, you know. But these records sold, the 45s and some of these records sold pretty well. You go into chicken shacks and juke joints and hear the stuff being played in the Chocolate City neighborhoods. As George Clinton once said, this Fred Jackson record is honestly a favorite of mine. I've played it hundreds of times. It just feels great. And is that Grant Green on the guitar? I'm trying to recall. No, Willie Jones on the guitar. Great record. Blue Note number 4094. So about 1962. Walter Benton now is a cat I also like a lot. And one of the things that made me think of him was his work with Kenny Clark and the great alto player Frank Morgan. And Frank Morgan's a guy that kind of slips between the cracks. His one record was on GNP, and then he disappears off the scene until the 80s where he makes a comeback. Bad heroin problem, but for a stretch in the late 40s, early 50s, Frank Morgan on the alto is showing up on some pretty great sessions, including that Kenny Clark 10-inch. That's just outstanding. And it's a great session for Frank Morgan, that Kenny Clark 10-inch. Walter Benton's also on that session. He's born September 8th, 1930, pardon me. He's in LA. He joins the Army briefly. In '54, he does that session with Kenny Clark, like I was talking about. He does some work with Max Roach and Clifford Brown. And he actually was enjoying working with Clifford. And in '54, '57, he works with Perez Prado, who's doing Latin stuff and touring the world. So it was probably a pretty good opportunity for him to make some money. In '57, he works with Quincy Jones for a while. Victor Feldman in '58, '59. He works with Freddie Hubbard on this record, and also Wynton Kelly and Paul Chambers. It's just an outstanding record on the Riverside label. Jazzline number 28, which is obviously Riverside. He also works with Julian Priester on one of his Riverside records. Max Rhodes, Abby Lincoln, Eric Dolphy, Slide Hampton. And then in '66, he walks away from the music and goes into real estate. And good for him. It's a pretty happy ending. And so Fred Jackson has a kind of a small story. Walter Benton has a rather small story. But he shows up on some landmark recordings. And this record with Hubbard, anything with Freddie Hubbard. Y'all know me, I'm a Freddie Hubbard guy. Number 46 is Don Wilkerson, another Texas tenorman. And what I love about the Texas tenorman is you can get a little bit of gospel, a little bit of barbecue, and a little bit of the blues all wrapped up in one record. You know, the Texas tenorman, it's a very black story, you know, and oddly enough, there's a bunch of white cats in Texas called the Texas Tenormen that are, I think it's a vocal group doing kind of country, vocal, pop stuff, and that's not the Texas Tenormen I was looking for, to be very clear. Born in 1932, he's actually born in Louisiana but moves to Texas. He works with Cannonball Adderley fairly early on. I'm guessing either in the South or maybe in Chicago. It didn't specify. He works with Ray Charles Group. He ends up becoming an arranger in Ray Charles Group for a while. He ends up working with Amos Milburn for a while, who I'm going to be honest, I don't know particularly well. While he's with Ray Charles, he's playing in a section with Arnett Cobb. So Ray knew that these guys were the blues. You know, he got it. And of course, what doesn't Ray Charles get? He works with Grant Green on some of his records, which is a natural fit if you ask me. Grant Green's on this record right now. You can hear him in the background there with Sonny Clark, Butch Warren, and Billy Higgins. In 1970, he starts working with a guy by the name of Sonny Franklin, and they have a big band. They have Arnett Cobb's working with them, Cleanhead Vincent's working with them, Clarence Gatemouth Brown, and he does some work with B.B. King as well later on in his career. He makes 3 records for Blue Note: Elder Dawn, 4121, 4145, Shoutin', and then this one I think was the first one, 4107, Preach Brother. And they're firmly Illinois Jack Cat, Arnett Cobb, Buddy Tate, David Newman. The Texas tenor sound, it's some syrupy gravy, baby. See what I'm saying? There's some honey in that barbecue sauce, so it's not going to be all thin and viscous. It's going to be thick, oily, stanky, the good. You gotta love Texas Tenorman. I'm a big fan of the Wilkerson stuff. He actually does make a session at Riverside as well, number 332. This is also an outstanding record with Nat Adderley, Leroy Vinegar, Sam Jones, Barry Harris, and Billy Higgins. Texas Twister. It's a pretty tough record to come by. Wilkerson stuff has gotten pretty tough to find in general. And I think this stuff just kind of grows on people. It's fun to listen to. You know, it doesn't require earphones, earmuffs. Number 45 on my list, Harold Vick. I'm a big Harold Vick guy. He's one of those those guys on Blue Note that sort of slips through the cracks a little bit. Bluesy soul jazz is what this guy's modus operandi is. Born April 3rd, 1936 in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. He's a gutsy player, you know. He plays hard bop, but his soul jazz is really what he does well. He kind of comes up in the R&B school. He's going to Howard University. He's playing with a lot of early R&B cats, cutting his teeth. He signs with Blue Note in '63, makes this outstanding record with Blue Mitchell, Grant Green, John Patton, and Ben Dixon. And this is his only Blue Note. And he does make a few other recordings for a few other labels, but they do come a little bit later on Muse, RCA, and Strata East. He's got 2 on RCA, I believe, from the late 60s, and I've not seen either of them ever. They must not have sold very well at all, on RCA no less. And then the stuff on Muse and Strata East is from the 70s, which is an era I haven't dove into very much, as you all know. He plays with Jack McDuff from 60 to 64, and he's on a lot of McDuff's recordings. And that stuff's mostly on Prestige label. And talk about your barbecue sauce, you know what I mean? You better bring a bib to eat with Jack McDuff, because some corn's gonna get sprayed around. There's gonna be some shit stuck in your teeth when you're done listening to Jack McDuff, especially when Harold Vick's in the camp. He plays with not Fred McGriff, the baseball player, McGriff, the organ player. Drawing a blank. I'm seeing so many names right now. My mind's a little bit frazzled lately. John Patton, Larry Young, Jimmy McGriff. There you go. Mid-60s, working with Walter Bishop Jr. He plays with Philly Joe Jones, Howard McGee, Ray Charles, and he ends up kind of back in the R&B camps, working with King Curtis, Aretha Franklin, Shirley Scott, Grant Green. He's R&B jazz. And that being said, as this era of jazz kind of merges into soul and R&B, to me it's a healthy place for jazz to go. It's kind of staying with the swing and the commercial viability of the music. And the more R&B stuff, to me, is less, hardly ever driven by ego. It's hardly ever driven even by money. It's driven by sexuality and by soul. You know, just there's a difference between telling a story and playing a bunch of fucking notes. And when you just play a bunch of fucking notes, you fall down my list. In terms of what I want to listen to, what I want to hear, you're just playing notes. If you ain't telling me a story, and my mind can't almost follow and see the pictures and the narrative, and just kind of even understand the kind of day you're having, something else is driving you. And it's that simple. When a player is playing, are they telling you a story, or are they just playing notes? And even some of the greats cross that line at times. For me, there's times where John Coltrane is just throwing notes out there. And he's one of the greatest of all time. And when he's telling you a story, he'll cut you through the center of your heart, you know? But we have to be careful about what's driving our playing. And for me, Coltrane walks a very fine line at times. And records like Giant Steps, there is some mathematics, ego, comprehension going on there. It's certainly not driven by money, but it's not really storytelling from the gut soul either, you know? And it certainly doesn't feel very sexual, Giant Steps. So it does become more cerebral and more egotistically driven. It's a fine line, and it's arbitrary at that. You know, it's up to your perceptions, but I think you can feel the sexuality in this. You know what I mean? You don't gotta work too hard. to make some movement, some rhythm to that groove. You know, storytelling's always going to be from the soul through the coded message of an instrument. That's the essence of storytelling. That's the soul speaking. And it's perfectly okay to love intellectual jazz driven by ego. It's fine. You know, when you listen to a lot of those 70s virtuosos, the Metheny's, a lot of those guys that are just super skilled, it often seems short on the storytelling soul aspect of the matter. And it's up for you to decide, as a listener, as a consumer, in the long run of your life, where do you want to end up? Where do you want to listen to? And it's perfectly okay to say, you know what, I like egotistically driven music that's displaying incredible virtuosity for its sake. I love complex mathematical constructs in my music. It's okay. It's not wrong or bad. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying for me, as I've gotten older, I've started to shun that more and gravitate more towards a guy telling me a story from the depths of his soul. Medicate me, man. Tell me that no matter how tough my times are, virus and unemployment, all that you've seen some things that are much tougher and you got through it. Chin up. I need that some days. And I don't get that from intellectual, egotistically driven music. I get that from soul-driven music. And soul isn't as much a sound as it is storytelling. Tell me a story. Number 44, the great Teddy Edwards. Teddy cuts his teeth on Central Avenue in Los Angeles, Dexter Gordon era, Wardell Gray era. He's there. LA had this crazy scene in the late 40s on Central Avenue. Jazz clubs, work. Guys were coming up from New York to be part of the LA scene for a brief window there. And it doesn't last forever, but this was not West Coast cool. This was West Coast hard bop, West Coast bebop, modern in every aspect of the way. Gray, Gordon, Edwards, these guys were kind of redefining the music from the West Coast. Born April 26, 1924, Jackson, Mississippi. He moves around, ends up in LA. He's playing at a place called Club Alabama, which is funny because he's from Mississippi, which is right next door. He's interacting with the Charlie Parkers, a guy by the name of Roy Milton, who I'll be honest, I don't know who that is. Vince Guaraldi, Joe Castro. So black and white there. 47, he does some work with the Dexter Gordon on the Duel. And Dexter for me is one of the all-time greats. I'm a huge Dexter Gordon fan. And my love for Dexter's grown greatly in the last few years, while my love for other players has diminished. Dexter's Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, he's in that lineage. And for me, that's the lineage that I really have placed great value in. He recorded until 2000. So Teddy Edwards is around for a long time. He ends up playing with Tom Waits for a little bit on the Heart Attack and Vine tour, which is a great record, one of my favorite Tom Waits eras. That's, to me, an interesting crossover. He has this great record on Contemporary 3606, Heart and Soul, with Jerry Wiggins, Leroy Vinegar, and Milt Turner. Again, this guy is a guts storyteller. Teddy Edwards, It's About Time with Les McCann, Vinegar and Ron Jefferson. This is on the Pacific label. The first one was on Contemporary. He has two more on Pacific, which I need to get ready. I think it's one of them. Sunset Eyes maybe is the other one. Teddy Edwards records are never cheap. This one's out 3588, a little earlier on Contemporary. This is with the great Howard McGee, one of the great trumpet players of the bebop era. He doesn't get the fame he deserves, but he and Fats Navarro, along with Dizzy Gillespie, defined the trumpet in the bebop era. And not Miles Davis. You know, Miles was a lesser figure in those days, and he needs to be put in his place at times. But Howler McGee's a great player. Stuff on Bethlehem's great. A couple records on United Artists that are great. But this record here with Teddy Edwards is outstanding. With Phineas Newborn, Ray Brown, and Ed Thigpen. So that's a pretty serious group right there. So you should really dig out Teddy Edwards when you get the chance. Plus, he played with Tom Waits. That's cool enough in and of itself. Ernie Henry, number 43. Born September 8th, 1926 in New York City. Love Ernie Henry. Very modern player. Post bebop. He works with a lot of the greats on the East Coast. Comes to a sad, tragic early end, sadly. In the 40s, he's playing with Tad Dameron, the aforementioned Fats Navarro. He's playing with Charlie Ventura, Max Roach, Dizzy Gillespie from 48 to 49. So it's a pretty strong lineage of guys he's working with in the late 40s. 50 to 52, he's playing with Illinois Jacquet. Again, probably the most unheralded guy in jazz from the saxophone camp is probably Illinois Jacquet. He doesn't get the love today he deserves. He plays with Monk in 56. He kind of has a little period where he disappears from 53, 54, 55. Resurfaces in 56, belonging to the LP era, at Riverside. He's working with Monk. He's working with Kenny Drew. He's working with Kenny Dorham. He's working with Art Taylor. He's working with Mingus some. And then he gets 3 or 4 records of his own at Riverside, including one where he shares the leadership role with Kenny Dorham. Great record. I'm not sure if I pulled that one or not. No, that one's under Kenny Dorham. I didn't pull it. But this Ernie Henry record is 222, number Riverside 222, which means it's the 22nd release in the Riverside Modern discography. And this is a really great Riverside early record. Dorham's on this. Kenny Drew, Wilbur Ware, Art Taylor, recorded in 1956 in the summer. Just really, people had high hopes for him at this point. 248 Ernie Henry Quartet, 7 standards on the blues, another outstanding record. This one has Wilbur Ware, Wynton Kelly, Ernie Henry, and Philly Joe Jones, so it's just a quartet, which leaves him lots of room to do Ernie Henry things. He's definitely got some bebop, hard bop edges to him, but he's still fairly rooted in the blues, which is always important. Ernie Henry last chorus with Lee Morgan, Benny Golson, Kenny Dorham, and Thelonious Monk. I think these are called from a few different sessions, if I recall, but it's after he passes, I think they issue this stuff, get it out there, number 266. So in the first 100 Riversides, I think he has 4 records, if you include the one with Kenny Dorham. Ernie Henry is kind of, again, under the radar a little bit, but at the time he was really highly regarded, and big things were thought to be coming for Ernie Henry. You know, he was going to be an up-and-comer, and he was one of those exciting newcomers that people were like talking about, and the polls were like, oh, this guy's going to be something. And then sadly, he ODs October 31st, 1957 on heroin, and really young. I think he was 31 when he died. You know, that's too young. The heroin epidemic in the black neighborhoods, it's something that I want to do an episode on at some point. And it's not being driven by black drug dealers. You know, it's coming from a much higher place of commerce. Whoever's shipping that stuff over in quantities from the Far East, it wasn't a local pimp trying to make a few bucks. You know, this was done from a high place of power. And if you ask me, it was done and designed to destroy the black community. You know, I don't think there's much debate about that myself, which might not be popular with everybody, but I'm not here to win popularity contests. I'm here to speak from my heart, and my heart tells me that they knew how to use drugs to subvert people, going back to the opium wars, you know. And so to think that the possibility of them shipping in heroin to weaken a community that was trying to climb itself out of a hole, and they wanted it to stay in that hole, doesn't seem super shocking to me whatsoever. In fact, my history books tell me that has to be what it was. History's ugly, you know, and the truth of our times isn't known in our time. So the ugly things that we're doing, you don't know about none of it. We might speculate on some of it, but what the future will know about us and how they will look at us, they'll be disgusted by the things that we unwillingly, unknowingly are helping to pay for with our tax dollars. There's some ugly shit happening in the world today, right now, that we know nothing about, that the future will know about, and they'll be like, man, how did y'all not know about that shit? And I'll be like, my bad, sorry, I could feel it, but didn't have the special x-ray vision to see it, you know? And you can see some corruption in your lifetime and recognize when things don't feel right or jive right, that something's not above board. I get that feeling all the fucking time. And when you live in Babylon, the world power, that sense is with you much more prevalently, because it's always the world power that has the most to hide and tells the biggest lies. You know, when you're England, when you're Babylon, when you're the Mogul Empire, ancient Egypt, the stories you tell your people, the narrative you publish as the official version that the people perceive of as this is why we did it, for noble justice, for freedom, for honor, versus the real motivations that come out in time, we're going to be ashamed of a lot of what's happening. But heroin in the black neighborhoods, that's just tip of the iceberg, not even what's above the water. It's the tip of what's above the water. There's a lot of ugly dirt happening in the world that they ain't gonna tell us about it. Why would they? You know what I mean? They're gonna distract us with everything they possibly fucking can so we don't even think about any of that shit. Number 42, Oliver Nelson. And Oliver Nelson, for me, has two separate careers almost. He's a great alto tenor player, but he's also one of the great arrangers, conductors, composers in jazz. He born June 4th, 1932 in St. Louis. He starts off with a clarinet like a lot of kids do. He's a great band leader as well. He plays with Louis Jordan from 50 to 51. 52, I can't hear what that says, my shorthand, sorry. But he's playing around, Prestige. He's making some great records for the Prestige label. And these records on Prestige, he's more of a player at this point. This is with Johnny Hammond Smith, Lem Winchester, New Jazz 8233. That's what we're listening to. Meet Oliver Nelson, New Jazz 8224. Afro-American Sketches, Prestige 7225. There's some guts there. Soul Battle, Oliver Nelson, King Curtis, Jimmy Forrest. So when you're playing with Curtis and Forrest, it's clear that you're a soul jazz voicing player. You know, that's where he was in the late 50s while he's at Prestige 7236 main stem. Impressions of Phaedra, this is on United Artists. Interesting record. This is where he starts to change his trajectory there quite a lot. Straight Ahead, 8255 on New Jazz. And then Oliver Nelson, Screamin' the Blues, New Jazz 8243. So a lot of his stuff ends up on the New Jazz part of Prestige. But he starts to change and gets more into arranging soundscapes. And And this is far less bluesy already. Far more soundtracky. You know, the composer in him starts to take over. He ends up in the Marines in '52. Ends up in Japan for a while. And while in Japan, he sees some classical concerts. And he makes a statement about growing up in St. Louis, I didn't know a Negro could go to concerts. That wasn't even a part of his universe. Wasn't part of his knowledge base. The blues, soul, jazz, that was really what a black kid knew coming up in St. Louis. All of a sudden he's in Tokyo and Kobe, and he's hearing these great classical bands, orchestras, symphonies with different arrangements and composed sections, and it really has a strong impact on him. And so he wants to start becoming a composer at that point. And he comes back, does that prestige stuff, but he starts working towards this. And then he eventually becomes one of the primary composers and arrangers of jazz in the 60s. He goes to Impulse, makes this great the Blues and the Abstract Truth record. And it's got Dolphy on it. It's got Bill Evans is on this. It's really an outstanding record. It's got mood, tempo, feel, blues, composition, arrangement. It's Ellington, Charles Mingus-esque in how it marries together different disparate sounds. Ellington can take anything and make it Ellington. Mingus could take some very different things and meld it into his sound. Oliver Nelson had that ability. He really hits gold with this record, and it's one of the highlights of 1960, 61 in jazz. It's got a pretty incredible lineup on it, like I said. Paul Chambers, Eric Dolphy, Bill Evans, Roy Haynes, and the great Freddie Hubbard. How many times can I say it? You add Freddie Hubbard to a record, you're going to make some noise. He follows that up on Impulse a few years later with more Blues and the Abstract Truth. It's with a very different group. It's still a great record, still important, Oliver Nelson, and part of his career arc. He makes this record for Argo 737, probably 64, maybe 63, 64. So this is a really fantastic record with his orchestra. It's a pretty big band he's working with, but composers want to have pieces to work with. Jerome Richardson, the great flute alto player, Phil Woods, Kenny Soderblom, Al Hoyle, Patty Brown, Ben Tucker, Snooky Young, Grady Tate, recorded in Chicago, Illinois. Great record. This is not that tough to come by, but it's in the $40 range nowadays as well. And that leads him now into the second part of his career, where he becomes primarily a composer and arranger. And I'm less a fan of Oliver Nelson, the arranger. This is Oliver Nelson plays Michelle, pop songs, Beatles songs, Flowers on the Wall, These Boots Are Made for Walking. It's a pretty light, fluffy affair. But again, when you're at Impulse, part of the deal is we need to sell records so we can put that next Pharoah Saunders record out. Oliver Nelson's sound pieces, Shut Up Your Smile, Patterns. It's got Steve Kuhn, Ron Carter, and Grady Tate. It's an interesting record. Impulse 129. Kennedy Dream, a musical tribute to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This again is moving towards like suites and really arranged, composed stuff. The Sound of Feeling and the Sound of Oliver Nelson on Verve. Full Nelson on Verve. and Jazz Interaction Orchestra, the Jazz Hat Suite, arranged by Oliver Nelson. And that's the tip of the iceberg, because he's also composing and arranging primarily on Verve and Impulse. And remember, Verve and Impulse ascend to the top of the heap in the 60s. Where in the 50s it's Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Contemporary. Those are the MRC, those are the labels that are really kind of leading the cutting edge in jazz and are the ones that are most collectible, I guess. But in the 60s, some of those labels kind of fall back. And Verve and Impulse ascend to become really prominent sellers, especially Verve. You know, Creed Taylor, and then Creed Taylor's also an Impulse initially, then Bob Thiel takes over. And they're both selling a lot of records across a pretty wide spectrum. Impulse's spectrum is far broader, of course, than what Verve was doing. But Oliver Nelson is conducting and arranging and composing sections for a lot of records across both those labels' artist stables. And so, for example, Jimmy Smith, he shows up on a lot of Jimmy Smith records, putting these big, brassy, arranged ensembles on top of Jimmy Smith Gut Bucket Blues. And some of it feels very ego-driven, you know? And Gil Evans has had a lot of success doing that with Miles Davis, you know? And there's kind of this whole movement now, the Gary McFarlanes, you know, Oliver Nelsons, Mingus has had a lot of success with his arranged works. So more and more you're seeing arrangements being put on top of jazz. And it takes a pretty good player to fight through some arrangements that are really loud and bright. And Jimmy Smith manages to make those records all pretty outstanding still. But I'm not a huge fan of a lot of Oliver Nelson's arrangements. I prefer him as a player. But he ends up getting into film because of it, mostly in the 70s, late 60s. So we're starting to see certain black artists having that liberty and license to get into Hollywood and film once we get into the 60s, into the 70s. And by 75, he passes at the age of 41, if I recall. Super young, dies from a heart attack, which is, of course, ultimately really sad. He gets his master's degree, so he definitely has the education to back that ego-driven arrangement sensibility. He works with Duke and the Count and Quincy all in the early 60s as well. All big arrangement guys, you know, so he's definitely in that whole camp. But Oliver Nelson's a super important guy, and you can't really separate the arranger from the player. It's the same career, and he definitely kind of shifts from one to the other. But as a player, he's ranked right about where I have him. As an arranger, I'd almost knock him down a few steps, but Oliver Nelson deserves a lot of credit. He's a very important guy, and there are some of his arrangements which are brilliant, starting with this record. This record has some pretty big arranged parts on it, you know, and this is where it works great, when there's still enough blues leaking through to make it stink. The blues has to stink a little bit, you know what I mean? There needs to be some rotten fruit going on, that funkiness, and this is a wonderful marriage of arrangement and jazz and blues. Really worth seeking out that record if you don't have it. But I'm guessing most people who are deep into jazz enough to listen to me talk every day probably have that record. Number 41. A guy that's probably too high on my list, Tina Brooks, but I love him. I listen to Tina a lot. And so, of course, you're going to gravitate to the guys you listen to a lot. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to put him in this group. You know, I can't help it. It's where I some of this is my love. This just came out, Tone Poet, this last year, Minor Move. It had an original cover that was awful, but it wasn't reissued. It wasn't issued at the time. It came out in the 80s with a bad cover, and finally it's been done justice. Recorded, I think it's in 61, maybe 62. No, 58. Earlier than that. And if I remember, Sonny Clark's on this. He is. I love Sonny Clark. Lee Morgan's on this. Art Blakey, Doug Watkins. Pretty serious group. And Tina's career should have been longer. He makes this great record in 61. 40-41. Doesn't make sense that that's before. Recorded in 1960. So Minor Move was recorded before this. I thought this came out, didn't sell very well, and then Minor Move got shelved. But I know that happened to Back on the Tracks as well. So maybe Minor Move was recorded first. Looks like it was. But this came out the same day as another big Blue Note release. I can't remember if it was Dexter Gordon or who could it have been. But it was a big name Blue Note release, and this got buried. It just didn't sell. And Alfred Lion, as much as he loves the guy, there had to be some business acumen to keep in business. And so Back to the Tracks never got issued. And the guy had a bad drug problem as well. And this got shelved, and did actually get a number, 4052. So it was intended to be released, but it didn't come out until much later. Also a great record with Blue Mitchell, Kenny Drew, Paul Chambers, and Art Taylor. So all three of these Tina Brooks records, Blue Note, are really fantastic stuff. He was born June 7th, 1932 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Plays with Lionel Hampton. Once again, Lionel Hampton shows up. He plays blues with a piano player by the name of Sonny Thompson for a while. And then a guy by the name of Little Benny Harris introduces him to Alfred Lion. And Alfred Lion agrees to record him. And these 3 sessions were all done. They were all top of the mark Blue Note sessions. He works also with Kenny Burrell, Freddie Hubbard, Jackie McLean, Freddie Red, Jimmy Smith. And he was an understudy for Jackie McLean on Freddie Red's version of The Connection, that play. He was an understudy for McLean in that. And like I said, I love Tina Brooks, which is why I have ranked so high. It's probably a little high for a guy that made 3 records for Blue Note. But even for me, Blue Note inflates your standing. You know, you make 3 records for Blue Note in 60, 61, that's going to have impact, you know, and it has value with today's collector as well. Anything on Blue Note is important. So Tina Brooks wraps this episode up. We're going to get into the top 40 now. And certainly what's to come is going to be all pretty high level royalty, super important, innovative, long careers, sold well, big impacts, large side works. These next 40 are all going to be fairly big artists, and the top 20 are giants. Even some of the guys in the 20s are massive artists that had huge impacts on the music. These 60 that we've covered so far, there's a lot of great talent in there. But it's mostly guys that you're going to come to later on, or you're going to come to through Coltrane, to the avant-garde, discover Pharaoh, Archie, Sam Rivers, those guys. You know, I've done an episode about how Miles Coltrane kind of delineates most modern collectors' collections. They kind of follow the trajectories of Train and Miles and discover the guys who played with them, and they start collecting those guys. And it's why a lot of jazz fans have Pharoah Sanders but no Lester Young. That's effed up in my book. If you don't have Lester Young playing with Billie Holiday, but you got a bunch of honk fests, you ain't listening to jazz. Sorry. And I know I pissed some people off with that shit, but jazz is rooted in the blues. Jazz is about storytelling. Jazz is rooted in sexuality. It's not rooted in intellectualism. It's not rooted in ego. certainly not driven by money. And for me, that's the separation even between black and white players. So many more of the white players were ego-driven virtuosos that were fantastic players. Amazing players. But jazz was a stepping stone to other things in their life and not a lifestyle. Mulligan, there's a guy that plays the blues, Jerry Mulligan. There's a guy that gets jazz. Even though he does some soundtracks and stuff and is a great composer and arranger, Mulligan always feels like he's coming from a place of the blues and as a storyteller. And so for me, for my money, it's about the storytelling. If you want to know what soul is, what guts is, what the blues is, it's telling a story. And the great horn players, the great sax players especially, because the saxophone mimics the male voice, it is telling us something. And it's about our ability to hear it, be empathetic and listen, and not be distracted by what all the critics and the marketing campaigns today tell us are important. Because what's important is the soul and the guts of this music and why it was made in the first place. We're going to overcome this struggle. We're going to survive somehow. And we're going to live to fight another day. Can I get an amen? That's the story. Tune in for the next episode. Appreciate you all. Much love. Peace.